When we look at the history of Florida's Constitution, we find that in 1885, Article 12, Section 12 mandated segregated education by race. It said, quote, "White and colored children shall not be taught in the same school, but impartial provision shall be made for both." The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson U.S. Supreme Court ruling is considered a pivotal decision because that is the one that institutionalized segregation throughout the South. The court ruled that a Louisiana law providing for equal but separate accommodations for whites and African Americans did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But long before that decision, Florida was considered a leader in segregated education. The Florida State Teachers Association was a Jim Crow-type segregated unit that worked with teachers who were African American at a time when school years worked differently, often taking into account the growing seasons when considering education for black children. And teachers at the time had fewer educational, professional, and compensated opportunities.
What we're going to talk about today is the Florida State Teachers Association. You know, when you think of the classic era of the civil rights movement, you know, there are some touchstone places that come to mind. You think about, you know, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, and you think about a very young Dr. Martin Luther King getting his first opportunity to become a civil rights activist, really out in the fore. And then, of course, you know, the bus boycott lasts for a year and it becomes really the kickoff for what people consider to be the modern era of the civil rights movement. Of course, ending with the buses being desegregated. And you can see this very iconic image of Rosa Parks sitting on the bus in her first ride in a non-segregated bus. You know, the next really big event, of course, is the Greenboro lunch sit-ins, where the North Carolina A&T students crashed the lunch counters at Woolworths and other five and dimes all over the South, and met with frontal resistance from white business owners and the white community in general. Again, some of these images are really iconic. Of course, that segues into the Freedom Rides. The Congress of Racial Equality makes the decision that they're going to challenge the interstate bus laws and segregation in a full-on capacity, something that had been started by A. Philip Randolph in earlier decades. But so they lay out this plan, and CORE gets going, and of course they meet with some resistance in Anniston, Alabama. The bus gets bombed. You know, many of the Freedom Riders are injured, and our good friend Diane Nash picks up the ball with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and continues on with the Freedom Rides. And it really forces the Kennedy administration to really re-examine what it was that they were thinking about racial politics, particularly in the Deep South. As one of their own, John Siegenthaler, was beaten during the Freedom Rides. Of course, you know, one of the touchstone events of the modern civil rights movement was the March on Washington, you know, which was an extraordinary event. Obviously, Dr. King delivers the I Have a Dream speech, you know, which President Kennedy turned to his brother and said, you know, that guy's good, on the conclusion of the speech. So, and you look at this for a minute, I mean, this is an extraordinary event. I mean, that's the Washington Mall in 1963 with a mixed racial crowd. You know, there's 8 people on the platform down, only one of whom is still alive. That'd be Congressman John Lewis. And, you know, really, the last great event of the modern civil rights movement was the Selma to Montgomery March, which really showed some strength and unity. But as the movement was starting to fracture a little bit along the younger students that were involved, and the Black Power movement was starting to come to the fore. Sort of the old guard, SCLC, Dr. King's preachers were really kind of, you know, struggling with what to do next. And of course, Dr. King embarks on the Poor People's Campaign, which takes him all the way to Memphis. And obviously, you know, his part of the journey ends there. But you're probably wondering to yourself, well, what does this have to do with, you know, anything that's Florida related? Well, Florida is a really interesting case in point. A lot of people have suggested that, you know, Florida isn't part of the South. It's sort of on the periphery, and, you know, we've got this sort of weird little island down here in the tropical breezes. But in fact of the matter, there was a number of civil rights efforts in the 1930s and the 1940s, particularly revolving around Thurgood Marshall and education, and a whole host of new, young, college-educated African-American teachers, particularly Noah Griffin and Harry T. Moore, and ultimately Hilda Turner from Hillsborough County. What they set out to do was turn the Florida State Teachers Association into an actual political force where, they would able to make some policy change in Florida in the way education was handled. So just backtracking a little bit, you get to see right at the end of the Civil War as Reconstruction begins, the United States government's really struck with, well, what do we do now? So they set up the Freedmen's Aid Bureau. It started out as the Freedmen Aid Society, and there was some thought that, okay, maybe we'll be able to set up some African American education opportunities. So early, right after Reconstruction begins, Chloe Merrick Reed kind of pops up, and she's got this, abolitionist bent. Her father's a preacher. She has, and I just discovered this the other day, that Jacksonville was a Union-liberated enclave during the Civil War. So, but the important part is Chloe marries Governor Harrison Reed, who became the first Reconstruction governor. And Reed's really a conservative. The funny thing about Governor Reed is I looked all over high and low, and this was about the best picture I could find of him. So apparently he was not all that photogenic, and nobody bothered to take a picture of him, or the cameras were too heavy to get to Tallahassee. I'm not sure which one it was. But anyway, so Governor Reed's wife really starts to push him in some sort of, what for that era, progressive bent. And one of the things that she talks him into is hiring Charles Beecher. Beecher's the son of an active abolitionist preacher, and if you look in any of your modern hymnals, Beecher and his father wrote an enormous body of musical selections that go along with liturgy, both with lyrics and without. So one of the important things that Beecher does is he establishes the Cookman Institute in Jacksonville, which becomes important later because that institute and Mary McLeod Bethune's institute hook up and become Bethune-Cookman. Beecher's sister was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. And as one of my professors pointed out, Miss Beecher wrote probably the best evidence of Florida propaganda in the work Palmetto Leaves, which really was like, hey, this place is great, you should come down. No short of tourism. So this guy's important, and we're going to have to loop back to him later, but Oliver Otis Howard is put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, and amongst the things that he does, and he believes that really the only track here to get African Americans in the post-slavery era is through education. So one of the things he does is he sets up Howard University, which as Reconstruction starts to fail, he goes to become the president. This will become important later because the real active lawyers, Marshall and Charles Houston, are the ones that were sprung out of that particular institution. So Jonathan Gibbs is the first appointee for the governor, and Gibbs is an interesting character. You've been anywhere in Florida, there's probably a Gibbs High School somewhere in your city. Gibbs is of mixed parentage, and you really can't tell from this photograph, but obviously Dartmouth educated, so he's an Ivy League grad. His church sends him down south to organize in communities. I don't know, stop me if any of this sounds familiar, but he's obviously predating the president by several years here. But he gets appointed Secretary of the State, and one of the things that Mr. Gibbs was really interested in was creating not only a good educational system for black students, but for white, and putting standards all the way across the board, setting a defined school year and making sure that there was equality in both separate schooling systems. Obviously, he struggled with that then as we are struggling with that now. So in the wake of some of these activities, the Florida legislature starts to make things really difficult for African American students and for people that are interested in coming down, people like Jonathan Gibbs, coming back to Florida and educating African American students. They put a licensing fee to make sure that, it would be an impediment to get good teachers into these schools. So Reconstruction ultimately grinds down to a halt. Jonathan Gibbs dies mysteriously prior to the withdrawal of the federal troops. And we go immediately into separate but unequal in sort of permanent status. The rise of the NAACP in 1909 really is sort of born out of the Reconstruction crash. And you get to see that, there's a nice quote there from James Weldon Johnson, who obviously is from Florida and becomes kind of important later. So the NAACP forms its legal defense team, and Moorfield's Story is the head of that program, but they had 4 really important things that they wanted to address here: suffrage, residential segregation, restrictive covenants, and due process under the law, because obviously those 4 things really make your citizenship valuable. Story wins a pretty important case early on, this Buchanan v. Worley, and I don't want to get into too much of the nuts and bolts of that. There are some lawyers in the room, and I don't want to get anything wrong. He wins some early victories, but as you can see, Mr. Story's obviously, old, circa 1917, and he's got a very old school way of handling the law. So he loses back-to-back cases, this Corrigan v. Buckley case, and this Gong Lum v. Rice case, where really it basically just reaffirms segregation. And at the end of the 1920s, the NAACP legal defense team and the presidents and the advisory council is thinking, well, maybe we need to do something different here and sort of readdress this. So one of the things they do is they take the law professor, Charles Hamilton Houston, out of the law college and put him in charge of the legal defense team. Of course, Houston's primary star student is Thurgood Marshall, which again becomes an important thing later. So Nathan Garland was a son of a wealthy stockbroker, and he got this huge inheritance, but he was a Quaker, and he didn't believe that if you hadn't earned the money, it wasn't yours to spend. So he basically gave it all away. So this block of money winds up in this executive council, and they're going to decide what to do with it. So Roger Baldwin, of course, is the originator of the ACLU. And James Weldon Johnson, one of our local guys from Jacksonville, Florida. If you have not read God's Trombones or the autobiography of an ex-colored man, I certainly encourage you to do so. Johnson's story is way more fascinating. He probably deserves his own talk. But needless to say, he's making an impact. So one of the things they decide to do is they are going to figure out a way to tackle this dual school system. And they want to try and tackle this at the university level, because they're concerned that if they wade right into desegregating school children, the backlash is going to be even more pronounced than it ultimately ends up being. This is kind of ingenious because they realized that there was no way for the state of Florida particularly to sustain or had any interest in sustaining the white schools, much less sustaining a separate entity for African American students. So this case is kind of interesting because this is Margold's plan here is they realized that, as the last line here, the entrance to the court, discrimination did exist in a legal sense. So this is important because Margold comes up with this plan, but it's going to take Houston and Marshall to implement it, but it's really the crowbar they're going to need to pry loose the walls of segregation. So at 2 prongs of attack. Again, like I said, segregation laws could not be overturned because they did not safeguard Negroes against unequal expenditures. And this is a big one. This is the 14th Amendment clause. And they decided that they wanted to go this route with it because they thought that they were going to be able to ultimately prove that that's the basis for the separate but equal policy. And really, the whole plan was to overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. So there's Thurgood Marshall, a dapper, young-looking gentleman there. But Marshall's first case of note, the first big win for him as an attorney, is here in Florida. And the Chambers case, again, plays a much bigger role down the road where it sets up the Miranda ruling later, because Marshall gets to the point in this case where he takes this all the way to the Supreme Court, where the due process violation for some prisoners had been violated, and he sets up that ruling for down the road. So this is the other big win for them, and this is Murray v. Maryland. And Murray says, okay, the University of Maryland decided that they wanted to not only not let Mr. Murray into the law college, but they were going to pay for him to go somewhere else. So the worst and the best part of this is it violates Plessy v. Ferguson, which is already established law. So because they have to have separate but equal. So this really sort of pushes that back to, okay, now you have to create separate but equal. But what we're going to have to do is have that be separate but equal. So this is another one of these moments where you get a little bit of a wedge to jam into this wall. Segregation and life for African Americans in Florida had gotten really difficult in the wake of Reconstruction failing. It's a big population number. Right now, currently, it's only about 18% of the population is African American. So, in this great migration out from 1910 to 1940, we lost a lot of the African American population. The other thing was, and this becomes important later when the Florida State Teachers Association is gathering to make these decisions, is it was incredibly dangerous for any number of African Americans to gather anywhere. As you can see, this is not a good poll to be part of. We're number 3 in the nation, and you think, on a per capita basis, given the Great Migration out, after the 1920 election, there was an incredible spasm of Klan violence to prevent African Americans from voting. Which, again, once that happened, it was very obvious that, to most of the African American folks, that, they were not going to be able to take an active part in society, and so they left. But one of the things that comes out of the 1920 election is a very young Harry T. Moore sees people organizing, and he sees people going after the franchise to get their voting rights back, and it stays with him and becomes important later. So the Florida State Teachers Association was sort of born out of the Association of Colored Teachers. Again, James Weldon Johnson, one of our guys, is a Renaissance man. He's the head of the organization from about 2 years, and eventually gives up and goes to New York because he's just can't survive in this environment in Florida. There's about 2,700 black teachers by 1936, and they're scattered all over the state. So keeping them organized was, somewhat of a task which they had not accomplished prior to this period in the late 1930s. But again, born out of the New Deal and born out of some of the Marigold money and born out of this sort of wave of college-educated African Americans that were coming out of Howard University and places like that, they had some interest in coming in and really making some inroads into segregation. So Noah Griffin. Noah Griffin is one of these guys. He's one of the first African American teachers to hold an advanced degree. He's from the University of Iowa. He's something of a Renaissance man. He got a block grant from the Farm Credit Bureau in my hometown of St. Petersburg to arrange microloans for African Americans to buy houses on the south side of the city, to start their own businesses, to renovate existing businesses. And he's one of the forefront members of this sort of new wave of the FSTA. I had a very nice conversation with his son, who's still alive, and is himself a Renaissance man. He's a painter, he's a musician, he's a lecturer, he's a civil rights activist. Just recently, I think it was 2011, Noah came back to St. Petersburg for the first time. They leave in the late 1940s, and he got an honorarium at Gibbs High School, which again, my part of the Pinellas County, down in St. Petersburg, but there's a Gibbs High School somewhere near you if you were from another part of the state. So Griffin really sort of embodied that notion that we're going to take our college education and put ourselves back into, what is a very hostile environment and try and make some amount of difference, which from a thematic thread you see all the way to, we saw Diane Nash earlier, this is young group of activists trying to make some inroads into taking down the walls of segregation. Harry T. Moore is another one of these guys. In the education system in the state of Florida prior, if you finished high school, there was a teaching certificate track. So as soon as you graduated, you could begin teaching. And that was the track that Harry took, which, again, very difficult to finish high school, much less as an African-American student, to find a high school to finish and get his teaching degree. Harry's a really interesting guy. And if you haven't read Ben Green's book before his time, I certainly would encourage you to do so. It's an excellent read. Harry was tremendously involved in Progressive Voter League and registering voters. And if you think about that number for a minute down there at the bottom, 31% of the eligible African-American voters were registered primarily by Harry. I mean, he was everywhere in the state all the time. He ran afoul of the NAACP towards the end of his life because they felt like he was getting too far afield because he was registering not only poor black voters, well-off black voters, but poor whites as well, and trying to build a coalition, much like the progressive movement had done at the end of the previous century. So the FSTA has got 3 goals at their annual meeting in 1936. They want a single-pay salary schedule. They want to consolidate the rural schools and the transportation of children, better buildings, better facilities, and they want a representative at the state and the county level to push their issues to the forefront. This is kind of eye-opening when you think about this for a minute. Black teachers were making about 61% of what their white counterparts were making, which is a pretty pitiable number. This is not a big number anyway. I mean, being a school teacher, for those of you that have worked in education, know that this is not exactly the most lucrative profession, but you're called and/or compelled to do this. The other thing that's glaring too is the student expenditure. We talk about this a lot in the modern era about dollars spent in the classroom, and you can see the disparity there. The other thing, again, as I mentioned, over half the counties did not have a high school for African Americans. They had nowhere to go. So once sort of middle school ended, they were done with school. So S.D. McGill is kind of an interesting character. He's sort of the changeover guy between Moorfield Story and Houston and Marshall. He's an established lawyer. He wins a few cases. He'd actually, up until just recently, been one of the few African-American lawyers to have over a dozen appearances in front of the state Supreme Court. So, but he and Marshall and Houston were from 2 different eras, and they were butting heads. So he gets an early court victory for Marshall and Houston's plan that came out of the Margold ideas. But starts to squabble with them over means and methodology of practicing law, and ultimately some of the follow-up lawsuits they have here don't go as well, and eventually he gives way to some other counsel. So this is a big one. Vernon McDaniel scores an important victory here because what he allows the FSTA to do, instead of taking this on one at a time, John Gilbert sued, Noah Griffin sued for equal pay. Of course, they all got dismissed immediately and were never allowed to teach again in the state of Florida. But McDaniel's case actually allows them to consolidate them and use them as a class action suit. So again, not to get too much into the nuts and bolts of that. So once that happens, there's a bigger block of African-American teachers that are going to be pushing against the state. And state officials at the county and the state level realized that they were going to need to be a little more discreet about this. One of the great and most interesting things about Florida is we did not have, for the most part, although there are some exceptions, we didn't have a Bull Connor. We didn't have anybody Orville Faubus-wise standing in the steps of the college going segregation now, segregation always, forever. There were some folks, certainly Jim McCall out on the East Coast and some others, but as Dr. Mormino likes to say, it's the land of sunshine and state of dreams. So you've got to keep the postcard version of Florida up because the only thing we're really selling here is more Florida. So we can't keep you coming down if you think we've got Klansmen and we've got bigoted law enforcement officials and we're doing everything we can to keep this part of the population under control. So Ben Wood comes up with this National Teachers Examination. And Wood spent the entirety of World War I studying African-American intelligence, and he believed that intelligence was native-born, and there wasn't anything you were going to be able to do about that. That's all you got. You weren't ever going to get any smarter, and you were going to there for the rest of your life. So it made sense to him that African American teachers weren't going to be as well suited to be in the classroom. They shouldn't get paid as much. So state officials in Florida, at the school boards and the Board of Control, grab onto this because they think, okay, now we've got an out. Now we can't just say, well, they're African American teachers. We're going to test everybody. And we're going to set the test rubric here. And if you can pass the test, you can get a raise. So again, just to reiterate what I just said there, this is a big one. They learned from Wood, 80% of the African American teachers were going to score below the white teachers because they hadn't had the same kind of training, they hadn't had the same kind of education, and they had not gotten the same kind of treatment all the way through their educational process. So this NTE thing comes to Florida in 1942. 200, and this was not an unusual situation. They'd pack you into, this is where this sort of insidious racism that you hear about, particularly in other states like Mississippi and Alabama. They packed 200 teachers into a room about this size, no air conditioning, no windows, and it was dimly lit with floor lights, and the proctors were walking in between the rows. So there was maybe 200 people taking the test. There was probably about 100 proctors walking around. So, and the individual counties, Hillsborough, Pinellas, Broward, Dade, this is great. This is exactly what we want. Now we don't have to pay them the same salaries that we wanted. So the FSTA is not ready to give up, and they are not going to let this go lying down. But Hilda Turner, a teacher in Tampa, who now has an elementary school named after her, sues because she had passed the test and got an excellent performance evaluation and still didn't get a raise. This is the evaluation form she got, and I can tell you I worked in human resources and personnel evaluation for about 10 years, and this looks pretty good, although I'm curious about this one, the personality and tact. Just reading a little bit about Ms. Turner, she seemed like somebody that was kind of a force of nature and seemed unlikely to take any guff from anybody. So I'm wondering, who exactly gave this review, and I'm sure that probably didn't go as well as they had hoped. But Turner v. Keefe, okay, so this is a big one because they don't win the case outright. But what the court says is, you now have to go back on a county-by-county basis, show us the rubric for the exam, explain to us why you gave the evaluation and the salary increase that you did. And at this point, most of the counties in Florida, sort of one by one, the dominoes fall because they realized that they weren't going to be able to back up anything Ben Wood had told them from a scientific standpoint, and that they were not going to be able to craft this in any kind of cogent way that didn't explain what they were doing, other than the fact that we were going to want to pay African American teachers as much as we were paying the white teachers. So one by one, the counties sort of slowly fall into line and redraw their salary schedules. So the upshot is really this, is that much like I said before, the African American teachers that got involved in the FSTA in the late 1930s, Hilda Turner, Noah Griffin, Harry T. Moore, obviously put themselves into harm's way. John Gilbert, who was the first lawsuit, lost his job and ended up selling insurance in Tampa. And I mentioned before, Noah Griffin stays around in Florida for about another 3 years, but he had already run afoul of the St. Petersburg Police Department a couple of times. Most notably, they had gotten permission to gather a group of black teachers in North Shore Park from the city manager, which you had to have in those days. If any group of African Americans were going to gather anywhere on the north side of the city, you had to get permission from the city manager. They had it, and the cops still showed up, rousted them. Noah Griffin talks about taking a baton to the head in an interview in the St. Petersburg Times. But he leaves Florida for good and never comes back. He dies in 1973, but goes out to the west coast of Florida, gets a job with the NAACP out there, and actually started the chapter of the NAACP in San Francisco. And like I said, his son just came back recently and was finally honored, and that was in 2011. So his father had been dead for a good long while, but at least now you're starting to see some amount of recognition for some of these folks. Harry T. Moore, obviously, I'm sure most, if not all of you have heard this story, but his house gets blown up 1951 on Christmas Eve. Harry's story kind of got lost a little bit in the sort of upwelling of civil rights studies in the 1970s and the 1980s, because he had sort of gone before that classic civil rights period when you think about Miss Parks on the bus all the way to Dr. King's assassination. And in fact, there was a tremendous amount of internal debate at the Southern Poverty Law Center about the monument that's out there with the civil rights martyrs, about what the cut line was going to be. And Harry just missed the cut, and I think as a result, some of us in this room know who he is, but, for the most part, really kind of, lost some of his stature, I think, in the movement. But again, if you get a chance, read Ben Green's book. So why does all this stuff in Florida matter? Well, what happens is it gives Marshall momentum, and they start to win some of these cases, and it got to the point where the last thing we can do now is challenge Plessy v. Ferguson and say, okay, separate but equal doesn't work, it's not going to work, it's constitutionally unjust, and it violates the 14th Amendment. So this is part of Marshall's oral argument at the Supreme Court, and if you want to read it, it's readily available, but it's just, it's very powerful, very brief. You don't get much time to say anything, but Marshall makes this argument, and of course, in 1954, he wins the case. And really, that's what kicks off everything that I showed you earlier. It's the old Bill Cosby line. I told you that story, so I could tell you this one. So there's an era of the civil rights movement that predates Rosa Parks that I think is as interesting and as important as anything else that has come after or is going on currently. Everything that went on here in Florida really allowed, as I mentioned, the crowbar to go into the brick wall of segregation bit by bit, as there's very rarely any situation where you're going to be able to make massive change overnight. And this is a long, slow revolution. Current scholarship right now, takes a much longer view of the civil rights movement, dating back all the way to Reconstruction. And some of the names that we mentioned, Jonathan Gibbs, who's an important figure who, again, makes an impact and disappears quickly. And some of the names of the people that we talked about here today. My fervent hope is that, as much as we recall Rosa Parks and Dr. King, and Thurgood Marshall, and people that and can recognize immediately that are identifiable, you're able to recall a Diane Nash, and we're able to call a Noah Griffin, and a Hilda Turner, and a John Gilbert, and just some of the folks that we mentioned up here today, and take those stories with you, and when the opportunity comes to recall or talk about them, please feel free to do so. They deserve recognition because, the group of us that were here in the Florida Studies program, one of the questions we got asked a lot was, well, did anything happen here in Florida? And I think we can prove with little equivocation that a number of things did happen here, particularly as far as civil rights goes. It's a cause that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm going to tell you a story that's just sort of a personal anecdote, and I'll wrap up. But so I was 7 or 8 years old, and there was a documentary on ABC about Bobby Kennedy, and I was sitting on the floor in front of my mom, who's sitting in the front row here, and I'm hopefully not going to embarrass her, but the documentary ends with, obviously, Bobby Kennedy's assassination in the LA hotel, and I turned around, and she had tears running down her face, and it's one of those moments that stays with you and sort of rolls you forward. So the highlight of really my educational process was the opportunity to meet John Siegenthaler, whose picture was up here earlier, and spend some time talking to him about the Attorney General and his time with the Kennedy administration. So, my graduate advisor, Ray Arsenault, likes to talk about the happy accidents of history, and I think this would qualify as one of them. And just in conclusion, thank you for coming. Thank you to Jim Schnur. I'd like to thank Ellen Babb from Heritage Village.